The elegant supervisor kept watching as the poor black student shared his lunch with the cleaning lady every day. When he finally stepped out of his luxury car at the boy's house, he revealed a secret that changed their lives forever. The leather shoes pinched Marcus's toes as he walked through the polished hallways of Hamilton Preparatory Academy. They were half a size too small, bought from a thrift store last weekend. His mother had pressed his white uniform shirt 3 times that morning, determined to eliminate every wrinkle. "Baby, you look perfect," she'd said, adjusting his blue and gold striped tie with trembling fingers. The same tie she'd spent 2 hours searching for at 4 different secondhand stores. "You're going to show them all just how bright you can shine." Now, sitting in his first period advanced mathematics class, Marcus kept his back straight and his eyes forward, just like she taught him. The classroom smelled like fresh paint and lemon-scented cleaner. Around him, 20 other students pulled out leather-bound notebooks and gold-plated pens. Marcus carefully extracted his dollar store notebook, making sure the prize sticker he couldn't completely peel off stayed hidden under his palm. "The Pythagorean theorem," Mrs. Henderson wrote on the whiteboard, "is fundamental to understanding advanced geometric concepts." Marcus's pencil moved quickly across his paper, each letter precise and clear. He'd already studied this last summer, working through old textbooks his mother brought home from the library, where she worked her morning shift before heading to her evening job at the diner. A movement in the hallway caught his attention. Through the classroom's window, he saw an elderly woman in a blue uniform pushing a cleaning cart. Her white hair was neatly pulled back, and despite the early hour, she wore a warm smile as she worked. The name tag on her uniform read, Mrs. Rose. The morning passed quickly. Marcus answered 3 questions in class, each time earning an approving nod from his teachers. But now came the part of the day he dreaded most: lunch period. The cafeteria buzzed with activity as students lined up with their credit cards and lunch accounts. Marcus found an empty table in the corner and pulled out his brown paper bag. His mom had packed him a sandwich, peanut butter and jelly on wheat bread, and a small carton of orange juice she'd bought on sale. "Gross, they totally messed up my order again," a voice complained from the table next to his. A girl in designer shoes tossed a barely touched chicken Caesar salad into the trash. "Daddy's going to be so mad when he hears about this." Marcus watched as more students dumped nearly full plates into the garbage. His fingers tightened around his sandwich. That's when he noticed Mrs. Rose again. She moved quietly between the tables, wiping up spills and collecting abandoned trays. Her movements were efficient but careful, like she was handling fine china instead of plastic lunch trays. As she approached his table, Marcus noticed the deep lines around her eyes, though her smile remained bright. "Would you like me to take that for you, dear?" she asked, gesturing to his empty juice carton. "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you," Marcus replied, handing it to her. Their eyes met briefly, and he saw something familiar in them, the same quiet determination he recognized from his mother's gaze. Mrs. Rose continued her rounds, and Marcus watched as she made her way to the break room at the far end of the cafeteria. Through the half-open door, he could see her sit down heavily in a metal folding chair. She reached in her pocket and pulled out nothing, just a small water bottle. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch period. As Marcus gathered his things, he glanced one more time at the break room. Mrs. Rose was still there, sipping water, her own lunch break passing in hungry silence. Walking to his next class, Marcus felt the weight of his scholarship hanging heavy on his shoulders. He'd earned his place here with perfect grades and test scores, but moments like these reminded him just how different his world was from his classmates. A tall man in an expensive suit passed by, his shoes clicking authoritatively on the floor. The supervisor, Marcus had seen him watching over the school's daily operations. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Marcus quickly looked away, clutching his notebook tighter. In his last class of the day, Marcus's stomach growled quietly. He ignored it, focusing instead on the English literature discussion about Great Expectations. The irony wasn't lost on him. When the final bell rang, he packed his bag carefully, making sure not to crease any of his papers. Tomorrow would be another day of navigating this world of wealth and privilege. But as he walked toward the bus stop, Marcus made a decision that would change everything, though he didn't know it yet. He thought about Mrs. Rose's empty break room, his mother's double shifts, and the half-empty garbage cans filled with perfectly good food. Something had to change. And maybe, just maybe, it could start with him. The city bus approached, its brakes squealing. Marcus counted out his fare in quarters, each one saved carefully from his mother's tips. As he found a seat, his mind was already made up about tomorrow's lunch. Sometimes the smallest decisions mean everything. The alarm buzzed at 4:30 a.m. Marcus heard his mother's quiet footsteps in the kitchen before he even opened his eyes. The familiar sound of bread bags rustling and the fridge door opening carried through their small apartment's thin walls. He pulled on his uniform in the dark, not wanting to waste electricity. The pants were getting short at the ankles. He'd grown an inch since school started. In the kitchen, his mother stood at the counter, carefully spreading peanut butter on wheat bread. "Morning, baby," she said, dark circles visible under her eyes. She'd gotten home from the diner at midnight. "Got you something special today?" She held up a small bag of baby carrots, a rare treat. They were on sale. Marcus hugged her from behind, breathing in the lingering scent of coffee and French fries from her waitress uniform. "Thanks, Mom." She packed his lunch with the same care she used when wrapping Christmas presents. Sandwich in one baggie, carrots in another, and the juice box tucked safely in the corner of the brown paper bag. "Make me proud today," she said like she did every morning. "Always do," he replied, shouldering his backpack. The morning bus ride was quiet. Marcus rehearsed his advanced biology vocabulary words, mouthing them silently. Mitochondria, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi apparatus. First period started with a pop quiz. Marcus finished first, earning a small nod from his teacher. In second period, they discussed colonial America, and he correctly named all 13 original colonies. But his mind kept drifting to the lunch bag in his backpack. By third period, his stomach was already growling. The baby carrots would have made a good mid-morning snack, but he had other plans for them. The hallways between classes were crowded with students comparing notes on their phones and complaining about cafeteria food. Marcus saw Mrs. Rose again, mopping up a spilled smoothie. Someone had tracked the pink liquid halfway down the corridor without bothering to report it. "Need any help, Mrs. Rose?" he asked, stopping by her cart. She looked up, surprised. Most students walked past her like she was invisible. "That's very kind, dear, but I've got it handled." Her smile reached her eyes, crinkling the corners. "You better get to class." Marcus nodded and hurried on, but not before noticing her hands, red and slightly swollen from hours of cleaning. When lunch period arrived, Marcus waited. He watched Mrs. Rose finish her cleaning rounds, then head to the break room. Like yesterday, she pulled out only a water bottle. His heart pounding, Marcus grabbed his lunch bag and walked to the break room door. Through the window, he could see Mrs. Rose sitting alone, rubbing her wrist. "Mrs. Rose?" His voice came out quieter than he intended. "Would you like to share my lunch?" She looked up, startled. "Oh, honey, I couldn't possibly dash. My mom packed extra today," he lied, opening the bag. "I can't eat it all?" From the cafeteria doorway, the supervisor watched silently, his expression unreadable. Marcus pulled out his sandwich, baby carrots, and juice box, carefully arranging them on the small break room table. With deliberate movements, he split the sandwich in half. "The carrots were on sale," he said, sliding some across the table. "They're really good." Mrs. Rose's eyes glistened. "You're sure?" Marcus nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. They ate in comfortable silence. Mrs. Rose took small, careful bites, savoring each one. Marcus pretended not to notice her wiping her eyes with her sleeve. "My Henry used to pack my lunch," she said suddenly. "Every day, for 30 years. But since he got sick..." She trailed off, looking down at the half sandwich in her hands. Marcus wanted to ask more, but the supervisor's shoes clicked past the break room door, and Mrs. Rose quickly straightened up. "Thank you, dear," she whispered. "You remind me of my grandson." The afternoon classes passed in a blur. Marcus's stomach grumbled a bit, but he barely noticed. He kept thinking about Mrs. Rose's smile when he'd offered the food, how her hands had trembled slightly as she accepted. On the bus ride home, he planned tomorrow's lunch in his head. Maybe he could save half his breakfast toast to share. His mom always said bread helped fill an empty stomach. The apartment was empty when he got home. His mother wouldn't return from the library until 5:30, just in time to change for her diner shift. Marcus did his homework at the kitchen table, occasionally glancing at the clock. When his mother finally came home, she looked tired but smiled brightly. "How was school, baby?" "Good," he said, watching her hang up her library badge. "Mom, could you maybe pack a little extra in my lunch tomorrow? The classes make me really hungry." She paused, concern crossing her face. "Of course, baby. I'll figure something out." He knew she'd skip part of her own lunch to make it happen. That night, Marcus lay in bed listening to the traffic outside their window. His stomach felt fuller than it had all day, but not from food. Mrs. Rose's grateful smile played in his mind as he drifted off to sleep. In the darkness, he whispered a quiet promise to himself. Tomorrow, he'd bring enough for both of them. Across town, in a much nicer neighborhood, the supervisor sat in his home office, making notes in a leather-bound notebook. On the page, he'd written a single name, Marcus Thompson. Below it, he began to write his observations from the day. The city hummed outside, a constant reminder of the world that separated people like Marcus and Mrs. Rose from their wealthier counterparts. But sometimes, in the smallest acts of kindness, those divisions began to blur. Word spread faster than spilled milk in Hamilton Preparatory Academy's polished hallways. Marcus heard the first whispers during morning chemistry class. "Did you see him? In the janitor's break room? With the old cleaning lady? Guess he found where he belongs." Marcus kept his eyes on his textbook, his pencil steady as he copied down the periodic table. He learned early that reacting only made things worse. Still, his shoulders tensed when a crumpled paper note landed on his desk. He didn't need to open it. Through the thin paper, he could make out a crude drawing of someone in a cleaning uniform. "Mr. Thompson," his chemistry teacher called out. "Perhaps you'd like to explain the difference between ionic and covalent bonds?" Marcus straightened in his chair. "Yes, sir. Ionic bonds involve the transfer of electrons between atoms, while covalent bonds involve sharing electrons." "Excellent." The teacher nodded, and the whispers temporarily subsided. During the class change, Marcus spotted Mrs. Rose in the hallway. She was struggling with a particularly stubborn mark on the floor, her knees cracking as she knelt down. "Morning, Mrs. Rose," he said quietly, pausing by her cart. Her face lit up. "Good morning, dear." She lowered her voice. "I brought my own sandwich today." "You don't need to dash. See you at lunch," he interrupted gently, noticing other students watching. The supervisor appeared at the end of the hall, his leather shoes clicking against the floor. He stood with perfect posture, observing the scene with calculated interest. In math class, Marcus overheard more conversations. "My dad says the scholarship kids should eat in a separate room anyway. Bet his mom's a maid too." Marcus gripped his pencil tighter, focusing on the quadratic equations in front of him. His mom's voice echoed in his head. "Your education is your ticket, baby. Don't let anyone take that from you." When lunch period arrived, Marcus found Mrs. Rose already in the break room. She was staring at an open brown bag. "Henry always made the best tuna sandwiches," she said as he entered, her voice catching. "But with the hospital bills, we had to cut back everywhere we could. He's got cancer, you know? Stage 3. Marcus set his lunch on the table, carefully splitting his sandwich. "I'm sorry," he said, meaning it. 37 years working maintenance at the university, Mrs. Rose continued, accepting half of Marcus's lunch despite her earlier protests. "Now all our savings gone to doctors and treatments." She wiped her eyes with a paper napkin. "I'm sorry, dear. You don't need to hear all this. It's okay." Marcus pushed the baby carrots toward her. "My mom works 2 jobs, at the library and Moore's Diner on 5th Street. Mrs. Rose's eyes softened with understanding. "She must be very proud of you." Their quiet lunch was interrupted by laughter from the cafeteria. Through the break room window, Marcus could see a group of students pointing and whispering. The supervisor stood nearby, writing something in a small notebook. That afternoon, the whispers grew louder. "Heard he can't even afford cafeteria food. Probably begs for leftovers." During last period, Marcus's stomach growled audibly. The girl next to him snickered. He hadn't eaten breakfast that morning, trying to save extra food for lunch. The bus ride home felt longer than usual. Marcus watched the city change through the window, from the manicured lawns of the school neighborhood to the cramped streets of his own. When he got home, he checked the fridge out of habit, but only found leftover condiments and half a carton of milk. His mother's library shift wouldn't end for another hour. Sitting at their small kitchen table, Marcus pulled out his homework, trying to ignore the hollow feeling in his stomach. The sandwich halves were getting smaller, but he couldn't bear the thought of Mrs. Rose sitting alone with just water again. The front door opened earlier than expected. His mother walked in, still in her library uniform. "Baby," she set her bag down, concern etching her features. Mrs. Chun at the lunch counter said, "She hasn't seen you eating your whole lunch lately." Marcus stared at his math homework, numbers blurring slightly. "Marcus." His mother's voice was gentle but firm. "What's going on?" He couldn't meet her eyes. "There's this cleaning lady at school, Mrs. Rose. Her husband's sick, and she can't afford lunch, and I just—" His voice cracked. "I couldn't let her sit there hungry, Mom. Not when I had food to share." His mother was quiet for a long moment. Then she wrapped her arms around him, holding him tight. She smelled like old books and coffee. "My sweet, sweet boy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You have your grandmother's heart." She pulled back, wiping her eyes. "We'll figure something out. Maybe I can pick up an extra shift at the diner on weekends." "Mom, no dash, yes." Her voice was firm. "You're not going hungry. Neither of you." That night, Marcus lay in bed listening to his mother moving around the kitchen, probably calculating how to stretch their food budget even thinner. The weight of being different, of not belonging in that wealthy school, pressed heavy on his chest. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Mrs. Rose's grateful smile, heard her quiet "thank you" each time he shared his lunch. Sometimes being different wasn't about fitting in. It was about standing out for the right reasons. The next morning would bring more whispers, more judgmental glances. But Marcus had made his choice. In a world that often felt too big and too cruel, sometimes the smallest acts of kindness were the only things that made sense. The numbers on Marcus's math test blurred slightly. He blinked hard, tried to focus. The hunger had become a constant companion, a hollow ache that made it difficult to concentrate. His mother had started packing bigger lunches, but that just meant less food at home. 5 minutes remaining, Mrs. Henderson announced. Marcus rushed through the last problem, his pencil shaking slightly. When he handed in his test, he noticed Mrs. Henderson's frown. It was the first time he hadn't finished early. In the hallway, the supervisor stood watching, his leather notebook in hand. Marcus hurried past, avoiding eye contact. "Hey, charity case," a voice called out. Marcus recognized Brad Miller, one of the wealthier students. "Heard you're running a soup kitchen in the break room." A few students laughed. Marcus kept walking, his second-hand shoes squeaking against the polished floor. "What's next?" Brad continued. "Gonna start shining shoes during recess?" Mrs. Rose appeared around the corner, pushing her cleaning cart. The laughter died immediately. She gave Marcus a small nod, her eyes concerned. "Good morning, Mrs. Rose," Marcus said clearly, ignoring the whispers behind him. In biology, his stomach growled loud enough for his lab partner to hear. She scooted her chair away slightly, as if poverty might be contagious. "Marcus?" His teacher called after class. "Are you feeling all right? Your last quiz score was lower than usual." "I'm fine, sir. Just tired." The teacher studied him for a moment. "You know, the cafeteria has a meal assistance program dash." I said I'm fine, Marcus interrupted, then immediately regretted his tone. "Sorry, sir. I need to get to my next class." He hurried out, his face burning. The meal assistance program had a separate line. Everyone would know. Lunchtime came, and Marcus found Mrs. Rose already in the break room. She looked up when he entered, her face etched with worry. "Dear, you're looking thin," she said. "Maybe today you should eat your whole lunch." Marcus forced a smile, pulling out his paper bag. "Mom packed extra." Another lie. He split the slightly larger sandwich, his hands trembling. "Henry's treatments aren't working like they should," Mrs. Rose said quietly, accepting her half. "The doctors want to try something new, but—" She trailed off, staring at the sandwich. "How much?" Marcus asked before he could stop himself. "Too much." She wiped her eyes. "But God provides. Somehow he always does." Through the break room window, Marcus saw the supervisor walk past, his expensive suit a stark contrast to their humble meal. After lunch, Marcus's mother's carefully packed carrots sat untouched in his bag. He'd given them all to Mrs. Rose when he saw her hands shaking. In English class, they were discussing the gift of the Magi. Marcus could barely focus on the story of sacrifice and love. His vision kept blurring. "Mr. Thompson?" His teacher's voice seemed to come from far away. The theme of the story? Marcus stood up, the room spinning slightly. "It's about—" The floor tilted beneath his feet. "About!" He heard gasps as his knees buckled. Strong hands caught him before he hit the ground. "Get the nurse," someone called. When Marcus opened his eyes, he was lying on the cot in the nurse's office. The supervisor stood in the doorway, speaking quietly with the nurse. "Low blood sugar," he heard her say. "Has this happened before?" Marcus closed his eyes, shame burning in his chest. That evening, his mother came home early from the library, her face drawn with worry. The school had called. "Baby!" She sat beside him on their worn couch. "Why didn't you tell me it was getting this bad?" Marcus stared at his hands. "Mrs. Rose's husband needs expensive treatments. And she was just drinking water, Mom. Every day, just water." His mother pulled him close, her shoulders shaking. "You can't help others by destroying yourself," she whispered. "We'll figure something out. But you need to eat. I can't let her go hungry." His voice cracked. "She reminds me of Grandma." His mother was quiet for a long moment. "Your grandma would be so proud of you," she finally said. "But she'd also knock some sense into that big heart of yours." She stood up, wiping her eyes. "I'm picking up an extra shift at the diner. Weekend mornings. Mom, no dash, yes." Her voice was firm. "And you're going to start eating properly again. Both of you." That night, Marcus lay awake, listening to his mother moving around their small apartment. He heard her counting coins from her tip jar, probably calculating how many extra hours she'd need to work. The next morning, his test paper was returned. A B-, his first grade below an A all year. "Everything okay, Mr. Thompson?" Mrs. Henderson asked quietly as he stared at the paper. Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. In his backpack, his lunch felt heavier than usual. His mother had packed it fuller, probably skipping her own lunch to do so. As he walked to his next class, the supervisor appeared, watching silently. Marcus straightened his shoulders, ignoring the dizziness that still lingered. Sometimes the price of kindness was higher than expected. But as he passed Mrs. Rose in the hallway and saw her grateful smile, Marcus knew he'd pay it again and again, even if it meant sacrificing everything he'd worked for. The cafeteria buzzed with its usual lunchtime chaos, but something was different. Mrs. Rose wasn't at her usual post. Her cleaning cart stood abandoned near the entrance, the familiar bottle of disinfectant spray untouched. "Where's your girlfriend? Charity case?" Brad's voice cut through the noise. "Finally realized she's too good for you?" Marcus ignored him, scanning the room. The break room door was closed, its small window dark. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Brad stepped into Marcus's path, designer shoes squeaking on the polished floor. A crowd began to gather, sensing entertainment. "Excuse me," Marcus said quietly, trying to step around him. Brad blocked his way. "What's in the bag?" "More scraps for your cleaning lady friend. Her name is Mrs. Rose." Marcus's voice came out stronger than he expected. "Oh, excuse me," Brad mocked, drawing laughs from his audience. "Mrs. Rose. Tell me, does she give you cleaning tips? Show you how to mop floors? Might come in handy when your scholarship runs out." Marcus's hands tightened around his lunch bag. "Move, Brad. Make me scholarship." The supervisor appeared at the cafeteria entrance, his presence unnoticed by the growing crowd. "What's wrong with helping someone?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying across the now-quiet cafeteria. "What's wrong with sharing lunch with a kind woman who reminds me of my grandmother?" "Ah, how sweet," Brad sneered. "Maybe if your family wasn't so poor dash, my family?" Marcus stepped forward, weeks of hunger and humiliation boiling over. "My mother works 2 jobs to keep me in clean uniforms. She skips meals so I can eat." "What do you do, Brad? Besides waste food and mock people who actually work for a living?" The crowd fell silent. Even Brad seemed taken aback by the outburst. "At least my father didn't abandon us," Brad shot back, recovering. "Where's your dad? Charity case." run off when he realized what a disappointment. Marcus's lunch bag hit the floor. His vision turned red. But before he could move, a firm hand gripped his shoulder. "Mr. Thompson, Mr. Miller, my office. Now." The supervisor's voice cut through the tension like a knife. In the supervisor's office, Marcus sat stiffly in a leather chair that probably cost more than his mother's monthly rent. Brad slouched in the chair beside him, all bravado gone under the supervisor's stern gaze. "Explain," the supervisor said simply. "He started it," Brad muttered. "Did I?" Marcus's voice shook. "Did I start it when I shared my lunch with someone who was hungry? Did I start it by being poor? By earning my place here instead of having Daddy buy it?" "Mr. Thompson," the supervisor warned. "No, let him talk," Brad sneered. "Tell us more about your charity work. Does the cleaning lady pay you back? Is that how you afford to be here?" Marcus stood up so quickly his chair toppled backward. "Mrs. Rose's husband has cancer." The words exploded out of him. "She works here because they need money for his treatments. She drinks water for lunch because they can't afford food and medicine. But you wouldn't understand that, would you? You've never had to choose between eating and keeping the lights on." Tears burned in his eyes. He hadn't meant to reveal Mrs. Rose's private struggles. The supervisor's expression remained unreadable. "Mr. Miller, you may go. Your father will be hearing about this." Brad slunk out, leaving Marcus alone with the supervisor. "Sit down, Mr. Thompson." Marcus righted his chair with trembling hands. "How long has Mrs. Rose been going without lunch?" The question surprised him. Since her husband got sick, I think. The treatments are expensive." The supervisor made a note in his leather book. "And how long have you been sharing your lunch?" "A few weeks." "Despite your own financial constraints?" Marcus stared at his hands. "Someone had to help." The supervisor was quiet for a long moment. "Your grades are slipping." "I know. Your mother works 2 jobs?" Marcus nodded. "And now she's taken on extra shifts to pack larger lunches for you to share?" Heat crept up Marcus's neck. "How did you dash?" "I observe, Mr. Thompson. It's my job." The supervisor closed his notebook. "You may go." Marcus stood on shaky legs. "And Mr. Thompson?" The supervisor's voice stopped him at the door. Sometimes help comes from unexpected places. The hallways were empty when Marcus finally left the office. In the distance, he heard the cleaning cart's familiar squeak. Mrs. Rose was back. He found her in the east hallway, wiping down lockers with slow, tired movements. "Mrs. Rose?" She turned, her eyes red-rimmed. "Oh, dear. I'm sorry about lunch. Henry had a bad morning. The hospital called." Marcus's anger at Brad evaporated. "Is he okay? They want to try a new treatment. But the insurance." She trailed off, her hands trembling on the cleaning cloth. Without a word, Marcus pulled out his lunch bag, somehow rescued from the cafeteria floor, and split his sandwich. They ate standing there in the empty hallway, sharing a meal that cost more than just money. That evening, Marcus couldn't bring himself to tell his mother about the fight. But when she came home from her extra diner shift, feet swollen and smelling of French fries, he hugged her longer than usual. "You okay, baby?" she asked, concerned. "Yeah, Mom." He helped her take off her worn shoes. "Just thank you for everything." She studied his face, seeing more than he wanted her to. "Something happened today?" Marcus thought about Brad's words, about Mrs. Rose's tears, about the supervisor's cryptic message. "Just learning some lessons," he said finally. That night, he dreamed about empty break rooms and full garbage cans, about designer shoes and cleaning carts, about the strange ways life taught its hardest lessons. Tomorrow would be another day of choices and consequences. But for now, in the quiet darkness of their small apartment, Marcus listened to his mother's soft breathing from the next room and knew that some things were worth any price. The next morning, Marcus's steps echoed through Hamilton Prep's hallways. Students whispered as he passed, yesterday's confrontation still fresh in everyone's mind. His mother's extra weekend shift had bought him a slightly larger lunch today. The paper bag felt heavier in his backpack. "You doing okay?" a quiet voice asked. Marcus turned to see Sarah Chun, one of his classmates who usually kept to herself. What Brad did yesterday wasn't right. Before Marcus could respond, Brad's voice boomed from down the hall. Well, look who's back. But something was different. Brad's usual swagger was gone, replaced by a forced bravado. The supervisor stood at the far end of the corridor, watching. Marcus walked past Brad without acknowledging him. He had more important things to worry about. Mrs. Rose wasn't at her usual morning post. Marcus's heart sank when he found her cleaning cart unattended outside the break room. Through the window, he could see her sitting alone, phone pressed to her ear. He knocked gently. When she looked up, her eyes were red. "Henry's doctor called," she said as Marcus entered. "The new treatment, insurance won't cover it. They say it's experimental." Her hands twisted a paper napkin. 20 years I worked at that hospital, cleaning their floors, and now they won't even... She broke off, shoulders shaking. Marcus set his backpack down and did the only thing he could think of. He hugged her. She smelled like cleaning supplies and talcum powder, just like his grandmother used to. "How much?" he asked. $12,000. She wiped her eyes. "Might as well be $1 million. The supervisor's shoes clicked past the break room door, pausing briefly before moving on. "Maybe..." Marcus hesitated. "Maybe we could start a fundraiser?" Mrs. Rose shook her head. "You've done enough, dear." More than enough. First period was a blur. Marcus barely heard Mrs. Henderson's lecture on algebraic expressions. His mind kept calculating impossible numbers. His mother made $12 an hour at the library, $7.25 plus tips at the diner. Even with extra shifts, between classes, he noticed something odd. Other students were watching him, but not with the usual mockery. Sarah Chun smiled as he passed. Even some of Brad's usual followers nodded respectfully. At lunch, Marcus headed to the break room with his paper bag. He found Mrs. Rose already there, but she wasn't alone. "I packed extra today," Sarah Chin was saying, placing half a sandwich on the table. "My mom always makes too much anyway." Two other students stood awkwardly by the door, holding their own lunch bags. "Is it okay if we join you?" one asked Marcus. Mrs. Rose's eyes filled with fresh tears, but this time she was smiling. They pulled extra chairs into the small break room. Sarah shared her mother's homemade dumplings. Someone brought fruit. Another student offered cookies. "My aunt had cancer last year," one of the girls said quietly. "The bills were scary. My dad lost his job once," another added. "We had to choose between groceries and rent sometimes." Through the window, Marcus saw Brad watching, his expression unreadable. The supervisor stood nearby, making notes in his leather book. After lunch, Mrs. Rose pulled Marcus aside. "You did this," she whispered. "You showed them it was okay to be kind." In afternoon classes, Marcus noticed more changes. Students who had never spoken to him were raising their hands when teachers asked about food insecurity and economic inequality. The whispers in the hallways had a different tone now. "Did you know the cleaning staff doesn't get health insurance? My dad's on the school board. Maybe he could do something. We throw away so much food every day." After his last class, Marcus found a note in his locker. He recognized Brad's handwriting. "My father yelled at me for an hour last night. Said I was an embarrassment to the family name. Maybe I was wrong. I'm sorry." Marcus folded the note carefully and put it in his pocket. Sometimes change came from unexpected places. That evening, his mother noticed his lighter mood. "Good day at school, baby?" "Yeah," he said, watching her count out coins for bus fare. "Mom, do you think people can change?" She paused, looking up from her tip jar. "I think people can surprise you." "Why?" Marcus thought about Sarah's dumplings, about Brad's note, about the students sharing their lunches in a tiny break room. "Just learning some more lessons," he said. Later, doing homework at the kitchen table, Marcus heard his mother on the phone talking about picking up even more shifts at the diner. His chest tightened. "No more extra shifts, Mom," he said when she hung up. "Baby Dash, things are changing at school," he insisted. "I'm not alone anymore." She studied him for a long moment. "Tell me." So he did. About the fight with Brad, about Sarah's kindness, about students sharing their lunches, about how one small act of kindness had started rippling outward. His mother listened, tears in her eyes. "Your grandmother used to say that kindness was like bread. You could always make enough to share." That night, Marcus wrote in his notebook, not homework this time, but ideas. Ways to help Mrs. Rose, to change things at school, to make a difference beyond just shared lunches. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Henry's treatment still needed funding. The system still wasn't fair. But something had shifted today, like the first crack in a dam. Sometimes standing your ground meant more than just holding firm. Sometimes it meant showing others where to stand too. The black Mercedes pulled up to Marcus's apartment building at exactly 7:15 a.m. Its polished surface reflected the early morning sun, looking distinctly out of place among the weathered cars and cracked sidewalks. Marcus was taking out the trash when he saw it. The supervisor stepped out, his suit impeccable as always, leather notebook tucked under his arm. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson." Marcus's mother appeared in the doorway, still in her diner uniform from the night shift. "Baby? Who's this?" The supervisor extended his hand. "Mrs. Thompson? I'm Mr. Richards, Director of Student Affairs at Hamilton Preparatory Academy. May we come inside? There's something important we need to discuss." Their small apartment suddenly felt even smaller as Mr. Richards settled onto their worn couch. Marcus and his mother sat across from him, perched on kitchen chairs. "I've been observing your son for several weeks now," Mr. Richards began, opening his notebook. "His actions regarding Mrs. Rose caught my attention." Marcus's mother gripped his hand. "If this is about the shared lunches dash, it is." Mr. Richards held up a hand. "But not in the way you might think." He pulled out an envelope. "I represent the Hamilton Foundation for Educational Excellence. We provide scholarships and assistance to students and staff who demonstrate exceptional character and human values." The room went very quiet. "Your son," Mr. Richards continued, "has shown remarkable compassion and integrity despite significant personal cost. The foundation would like to offer him a complete scholarship package, including daily meals." Marcus's mother's grip tightened. "What's the catch?" "No catch, Mrs. Thompson. Simply recognition of values we wish to encourage." He turned to Marcus. "Your grades have suffered recently. This will help you focus on your studies again." "And Mrs. Rose?" Marcus asked. Mr. Richards smiled for the first time. "I was hoping you'd ask." He pulled out another envelope. "The foundation is also extending health insurance benefits to all full-time maintenance staff, retroactive to the beginning of this year. This will cover Mr. Rose's treatments." Mrs. Thompson started crying quietly. Marcus just stared. "There's more," Mr. Richards said. "Your mother's dedication to your education has not gone unnoticed. The foundation would like to offer her a position in our administrative offices. Better hours, full benefits, and significantly higher pay than her current jobs combined." I don't have the right experience," Mrs. Thompson whispered. "You have the right character. That's what we value most." Mr. Richards stood. "Take some time to discuss it. I'll need your answer by tomorrow." After he left, Marcus and his mother sat in stunned silence, staring at the envelopes on their coffee table. "I need to tell Mrs. Rose," Marcus finally said. They found her in the school break room, hands trembling as she read the letter from the foundation. When she looked up, her face was streaked with tears. "Henry's treatments?" she whispered. "They'll be covered?" Mr. Richards nodded. "Completely?" Mrs. Rose collapsed into a chair. "God does provide," she said softly. "Through angels we never expect." The news spread quickly through the school. By lunchtime, the break room was packed again, but this time with celebrating students and staff. Sarah Chun brought special dumplings her mother had made just for the occasion. Even Brad showed up, awkwardly offering congratulations. "My father's on the foundation board," he admitted quietly to Marcus. After what happened, he asked a lot of questions about how the school treats scholarship students and staff. "I guess some good came from me being a jerk." Marcus's mother arrived that afternoon to accept the foundation's job offer. Standing in her diner uniform in the elegant school office, she looked both out of place and exactly where she belonged. "You did this," she told Marcus later. "Your kindness opened all these doors." But it wasn't over. That evening, Mr. Richards called an emergency assembly. The entire school gathered in the auditorium. "Recent events have brought to light some inequities in our community," he announced. "The foundation has decided to make some changes." The new policies rolled out one by one. Free lunch program for all scholarship students, health benefits for all staff, including part-time creation of a student-led community outreach committee, new curriculum additions focusing on social responsibility. Marcus sat between his mother and Mrs. Rose, hardly believing what he was hearing. Saracen caught his eye from a few rows back and gave him a thumbs up. After the assembly, Mr. Richards pulled Marcus aside. "You know what truly impressed me," he said. "Not just your kindness to Mrs. Rose, but how you maintained your dignity despite everything. That's the kind of character we want to encourage here." That night, Marcus helped his mother pack up her diner uniform for the last time. She would start her new job on Monday. "No more night shifts," she said wonderingly. "No more missing your school events. No more skipping meals," Marcus added. She hugged him tight. "Your grandmother would be so proud." Later, lying in bed, Marcus thought about how much had changed in just one day. The black Mercedes that had seemed so out of place this morning had brought more than just Mr. Richards. It had brought hope, dignity, and change. His phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Rose. "Henry started the new treatment today. Doctor says the outlook is good. Thank you, dear angel." Sometimes the biggest changes started with the smallest acts of kindness. A shared lunch, a simple friendship, a willingness to stand up for what's right. The next morning, Marcus walked into Hamilton Prep with his head held high. His second-hand shoes still squeaked on the polished floors, but now they walked a path that others might follow. In the break room, students from all backgrounds shared their lunches together, the divisions of wealth and status beginning to blur in the face of simple human kindness. And somewhere in the hallways, Mr. Richards watched, making notes in his leather book about how one boy's compassion had transformed an entire school. The cafeteria looked different now. Instead of clear divisions between scholarship and wealthy students, the tables had become a mix of backgrounds and stories. Sarah Chin's homemade dumplings were traded for Brad Miller's gourmet sandwiches, while Marcus's simple peanut butter and jelly, now by choice rather than necessity, found eager takers. "You changed everything," Sarah said, sliding into the seat next to Marcus. "Look." Across the room, a group of students who used to throw away half their lunches were collecting unopened drinks and untouched fruit for the new food-sharing program. The initiative, started by Brad of all people, ensured no food went to waste. "I didn't change anything," Marcus replied. "People just needed to see what was possible." Mrs. Rose appeared at their table, no longer pushing a cleaning cart. Her new position as staff welfare coordinator kept her busy with organizing benefits and support programs for the maintenance team. "Henry's doctor called," she announced, beaming. "The treatments are working. His numbers are improving every week." The students cheered. Brad, who had been walking past, stopped to listen. "That's amazing, Mrs. Rose," he said sincerely. "My dad was asking about him yesterday." Marcus watched the interaction with quiet amazement. The same boy who had mocked him weeks ago was now regularly attending community outreach committee meetings. Mr. Richards appeared in the cafeteria doorway, observing as always. But now his presence brought smiles instead of anxiety. His foundation's changes had rippled through the school like waves in a pond. "Marcus?" Mrs. Rose touched his shoulder. "Your mother called. She wants you to stop by her office after lunch." The word still felt strange. His mother's new office, with its nameplate reading Community Relations Coordinator, was a far cry from her old diner station. He found her organizing files, looking professional in her new blazer. "Baby, look at this," she said excitedly, showing him a spreadsheet. "The foundation approved my proposal. We're starting a mentorship program for scholarship students' families. Job training, education resources, childcare assistance." Her eyes sparkled with purpose. Gone were the exhausted shadows, the worry lines, the constant mental calculations of bills versus hours. "Mom, that's incredible. And there's more." She pulled out a brochure. "The foundation is expanding the program to other schools. They want us to help set up similar initiatives across the district." The ripples were becoming waves. Back in class, Marcus noticed more changes. Teachers had begun incorporating discussions about social responsibility into their lessons. In economics, they calculated the real cost of healthcare. In literature, they explored themes of class and privilege with new understanding. Mr. Thompson, his English teacher, called after class. "The foundation is starting a scholarship essay contest. Would you consider sharing your story?" My story? About Mrs. Rose, the lunches, how it led to all these changes. It could inspire other schools to follow our model. During afternoon break, Marcus found Brad alone in the hallway, staring at the community bulletin board. My father used to say money was the only thing that mattered, Brad said without turning around. Success meant having the biggest house, the most expensive car. But he was wrong, wasn't he? Marcus stood beside him, looking at the new flyers advertising support programs and community initiatives. Money matters, Marcus replied. But how we use it matters more. Brad nodded slowly. I've been thinking about college. Instead of business school like Dad wants, maybe social work? Or education policy? Before Marcus could respond, Sarah rushed up with exciting news. The student committee had convinced local restaurants to donate their unused food to families in need. And guess who's leading the distribution program? She asked, grinning. Brad's dad. The changes weren't just at school anymore. Parents who had never interacted were now working together on community projects. Wealthy families were opening their eyes to realities they'd ignored. Scholarship families were finding new opportunities and support. After school, Marcus visited Mrs. Rose in her new office. Photos of Henry's recovery progress decorated her desk. The foundation called, she said. They want to feature our story in their annual report. Show other schools what's possible. Our story. Yes, dear. How a simple act of sharing lunch opened so many hearts. She wiped her eyes. Henry's coming home next week. The doctors say he's strong enough now. In the hallway, Mr. Richards was speaking with a group of visitors from another school district. It started with one student. He was saying, one choice to show kindness, despite personal cost. Marcus slipped past quietly, but not before hearing one visitor ask, and you really think we could implement something similar at our school? We know you can, Mr. Richards replied. The model is proven now. All it takes is one spark. That evening, Marcus sat with his mother on their small balcony. She was still in her work clothes, but now they were clothes of choice rather than necessity. Did you ever think, she asked, when you first shared your lunch with Mrs. Rose, that it would lead to all this? Marcus thought about the changes he'd seen. The mixed tables in the cafeteria, Brad's transformation, the foundation's expansion plans, his mother's new career. I just didn't want her to be hungry, he said simply. His mother squeezed his hand. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness have the biggest impact. Below their balcony, a black Mercedes pulled up, Mr. Richards arriving for a community planning meeting. Once, that car had seemed like a symbol of everything Marcus couldn't have. Now it was just transportation for someone working toward the same goals. The world was changing one lunch table at a time. 1 month later, Hamilton Preparatory Academy's auditorium was packed. Parents, students, and staff gathered for what Mr. Richards called a community celebration. But everyone knew it was more than that. It was a testament to transformation. Marcus sat between his mother and Mrs. Rose in the front row. Henry Rose was there too, thin but smiling, his hand clasped tightly in his wife's. The cancer treatments were working. His latest scans showed remarkable improvement. I never thought I'd be here, Henry whispered to Marcus. Not just alive, but seeing all this change. On stage, Mr. Richards stepped up to the podium. 1 month ago, we witnessed the start of something extraordinary. It began with a sandwich shared in a break room. Marcus felt his cheeks warm as heads turned toward him. His mother squeezed his hand. But what followed was beyond anything we could have imagined. Today, we're not just celebrating new programs or policies. We're celebrating a fundamental shift in how we view our community. Brad took the stage next, looking different in his humility than he had in his arrogance. I used to think being wealthy made me better than others, he admitted. Then I saw true richness, in kindness, in character, in compassion. My father and I are proud to announce that the Miller Family Foundation will be matching all Hamilton Foundation grants for the next 5 years. Applause filled the auditorium. Brad's father, sitting nearby, wiped his eyes. Sarah Chun presented the results of the first month's food sharing program. Over 1,000 meals distributed, 0 waste in the cafeteria, and new partnerships with local restaurants and food banks. And this is just the beginning, she announced. 10 other schools have already adopted our model. Mrs. Thompson took the stage next, confident in her new role. Our community support programs have helped 30 families find better employment, provided childcare for working parents, and created educational opportunities for those who thought they were out of reach. She paused, fighting tears. As someone who used to work 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, I can tell you, these changes are life-altering. Marcus watched his mother shine in her moment, remembering her exhausted shuffling between the library and diner. Now she was helping others find their way out of similar struggles. Mrs. Rose spoke about the staff welfare program, her voice strong with purpose. Every member of our maintenance team now has full health coverage, fair wages, and dignity in their work. My Henry is alive because of these changes. The assembly shifted to recognize the first recipients of the new community scholarships. 20 students from struggling families, all inspired by Marcus's story, would start at Hamilton Prep next semester. But most importantly, Mr. Richards concluded, we've learned that true education goes beyond textbooks. It's about character, compassion, and the courage to make a difference. He gestured to Marcus. Would you join me on stage? Marcus walked up, his second-hand shoes no longer squeaking. One of his mother's first purchases with her new salary had been proper footwear for him. Marcus Thompson saw hunger and chose to share. He faced mockery and chose kindness. He had every reason to think only of himself, but he chose to think of others. And in doing so, he taught us all a valuable lesson. The audience stood, applauding. Marcus saw tears on many faces, not of pity or sadness now, but of hope and determination. After the ceremony, people lingered in the hallways, sharing stories and plans. Brad and his father were deep in conversation with a group of business leaders about expanding the program. Sarah was explaining the food-sharing system to visitors from other schools. You did good, baby, his mother said, straightening his tie. A new one, bought with her own money, not scrounged from thrift stores. Mrs. Rose hugged him tight. My Henry's alive because of you, she whispered. No, Marcus corrected gently. He's alive because people finally saw what was right in front of them. All I did was share a sandwich. Mr. Richards overheard and shook his head. You did much more than that. You showed us who we could be. Later that evening, Marcus stood in the break room where it had all started. The small space had been transformed into a comfortable gathering spot, with proper tables and chairs, a mini fridge stocked with snacks, and photos on the walls of smiling staff members and students. Sarah found him there, remembering where it began, trying to understand how sharing lunch led to all this. Because it wasn't just lunch, she said simply. It was dignity, respect, humanity. You saw Mrs. Rose as a person, not a position. That made others see differently too. The next day, things moved forward as they had been, but with purpose now, with awareness. The cafeteria remained integrated, friendship crossing all boundaries. The maintenance staff worked with new confidence, knowing they were valued members of the community. Marcus's mother thrived in her role, her natural compassion finding perfect expression in helping others. Mrs. Rose's office became a hub of support and encouragement. Henry continued to improve, his recovery a symbol of the healing that was possible. And Marcus? He kept sharing his lunch, not from necessity now, but from choice. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness created the biggest changes. In his leather notebook, Mr. Richards made one final entry about the transformation at Hamilton Preparatory Academy. But perhaps the simplest summary came from Brad, who had once been the face of privilege and prejudice. You know what I learned? He said to Marcus as they worked on plans for the next community project. True wealth isn't in what you have. It's in what you share. And that was the real legacy, not the programs or policies, but the fundamental shift in hearts and minds. A revolution that started with a sandwich, shared in a break room, between a scholarship student and a cleaning lady who just needed someone to see her humanity. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices. And sometimes, those choices ripple outward, touching lives in ways we never imagined possible.